Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 3, on page 1234. If you're following the pages and want to find them online, they're at ayinbeis.com. So continuing let's call it the growth and development of a human being, both on a biological level, but primarily the real focus here in Avodah, as we grow from natural, subjective, and even intelligent creatures to becoming divine creatures. So there's a step-by-step process, the general steps of mutva, murgish, muskel, loosely translated as a natural mutva, that which is intrinsic and inherent naturally to us, even if it's still concealed, corresponding to ibur, like a state of pregnancy. It's there, but it's concealed. Going to murgish, where emotions are being felt and sensed. And that too goes through a process of growth. Literally, like he said, like a tree, like a plant that continues to grow. Moving to muskel, first the muskel that informs the murgish, the midas, guides them, informs them, or even earlier, recognizes and is aware. Then going to higher levels of muskel, where you concentrate and you contemplate on things that bring you to an emotional appreciation, but it's still about your subjective needs, to moving to a muscle where it becomes more objective what God is like, but first a God that relates to existence, then a God beyond existence, and that itself, we've moved from Binah to Chochma. And we're in the middle of the discussion of the comparison of the two, where Binah is more on our terms. It's already on a mature contemplative level, meaning our minds are fully at work, but it's still something that I understand, I relate to, I grasp. And therefore, Binah, like the mother, gives birth to the midas and associates with them. They're both in a state of sensation, of feeling, of experiencing something. Whereas Chochma, like the father, the midas there don't even have shape and form, like in the tipas mayachav, like in the seed, where even though it carries the genetic code and it carries that which the child's personality will ultimately develop, but there it's in a form of like called not mitzias and completely sublimated. And the reason for that is because Chochma is like Ayin and Binah is like Yesh. Now, on page 1223 and 24, what we learned yesterday, is tying it all together, that the midas, that the Binah midas and b'chinas mitzias davar, b'chochma gam sheyesh shamokel the midas, ein b'chinas mitzias klal, like I just explained. And that's why the primary place where midas take shape and form are their birth through Binah. And then he went on to say something more, another key point in this, that also the distinction, the hischalkus of midas, because that's what really makes them unique. When everything's inside of a seed, whether it's chesed or gvura, it's all in the seed, just like, let's say, the seed of an apple tree. So all the elements of the tree, whether it's the branches, the leaves, the fruit, in the seed, there's no distinction between them. Like he called it before, like a heyuli. So here too, when you're talking in Chochma, the seed of an idea, the seed of cognizance, the seed of consciousness, things that Chesed and Gvura don't have any ischalkos. Whereas in Binah, they do. Because Binah itself is defined by ischalkos. Binah itself is defined. What does Binah mean? Binah takes an idea and develops it. Its whole purpose is to structure it. And structure means ischalkos, distinction. And that's why Binah, it says, because Dafke Basoga the Binah Boyam Mitzias, and Mitzias is defined by Ischalkus. That's one of the key things when you say something is of substance, or something that does not have substance yet, or substanceless. It's like shapeless in a way. Like you said before, when he talked the difference between water, liquid, and a solid, or liquid, the Mayim Rakia. One is still fluid and can go in many different directions. Once it solidifies, this is the approach, chesed or gvura or whatever, whether chayiv or potter or osir or mutter, and so on. And he explained this is chalkus is not just on the midas level, it's also on the hisbonenus level. Every emotion, whether it's the emotion of love and attraction, or the emotion of yira, awe and respect, each one comes from a particular contemplation. One contemplation brings to love and closeness, and one contemplation brings to respect and awe. And he explained the difference. They said when you're mizbeinen on how godliness is close to you, and we discussed this, how God provides for you blessings, life, all the different things. That's what awakens from such a contemplation in Binah, midas ha'ava, not yira. On the other hand, when you think about God's distance, when I say distance, I mean how far apart, how different He is than us. Havdalah, v'reimamus, v'isnasus, as He said. Hagba v'aremus delakus. So that's like thinking about the king, how the king is not like us. You're not allowed to see the king unclothed, and you're not allowed to sit on his throne. That means he's not one of you, one of us. That evokes the midah of yira, not av. He qualified it by saying that there's still a form of yira that can also come from contemplating how God is completely beyond, and also down here, that's yira law. But he said it's not a midah. Then it's not she'en b'chinas midah. And the same thing the other way around. There is an ava that's associated when you are thinking and contemplating on God's infinity, so-called, completely beyond us. There is a yearning and longing to be part of that. But that too, he qualified and said, he associated that with something that is embedded in us, the Ratzon, like he said, ha'atzmi shebenefesh. In other words, it's not something that comes from contemplation. Even though it's coming b'tzat haflo v'arememus. And I asked the question, didn't we learn earlier that there is a contemplation on that level? So that's not clear completely, but I'm just repeating what we learned. But the main focus here is on the tam v'das. That there's a seichel miyuchad l'chol midah b'fnei atzmei. U'memela gam hamidah is boim b'b'chinas ischalkus b'chinas avdala zemizeh. And I also explained why is Alter Rebbe Rashab so intent on focusing on this point, because remember he's giving us an operator's manual, essentially how to operate, how to make operational our growth and connection. You moving from the mortal or the human, the natural to the beyond the natural, to the divine. So it's critical to understand that to do that, you need to have each midah defined, and you need to have every possible contemplation, because the key to reaching such higher levels is to contemplate on something specific that awakens and stimulates a particular midah emotion. First, it's awakened in the mind, like we said, the stimulation, excitement in the mind, before it becomes an emotional in the heart, an actual full-blown emotion. And this will also help us reach higher levels all the way to Chochma. But right now we're still focusing on Binah, and the process of contemplating that gives birth to Midas. Just for the record, this is actually the essential theme of chapter 3 in Tanya, the second half of chapter 3, where he talks about how Chabad gives birth to Midas. Also talking about the same idea, that we're not talking about the natural emotions we have, but the ones that are generated and stimulated and aroused by contemplation. Okay. So then we read the parentheses, to even further emphasize Binah's power of Ischalkus, that also the letters of thought and speech come from the Gvuras of Ima. So every particular idea, when you break it down into details, it has different permutations, different combinations, both in thought and speech, when you're breaking and think of an idea in details, and those details are coming from the Hasaga of Binah. So that further underscores the structural element and the details that Binah provide, which in turn give birth to particular structural motions. So here you have Binah being somewhat of an interface between the seamless and shapeless Chochma to the very structured emotions that define a human being. And in this case, that define our service to God, whether it's Ava or Yira. And those are the two midas he's focusing on, not Tiferes and not the other ones. And that's where we stopped, at the end of the parentheses. In case you have any question before I continue, even though this was a summary, I'd be happy to take any question. And then we'll begin from the line of Kiyadua, the word Umekol Mokim Yesh Gamkein. And if anyone want to ask or clarify anything, or everything is good. So let's start. Umekol Mokim. Though we just explained the distinction, what we call his chalkus, the breakdown, the details of Binah, which in turn give birth to the details of the detailed structured midas, emotions, like the mother's womb. The tipa is only a seed, the father's seed. In the womb, the fetus develops just like, again, the seed of a tree, and then as it develops into a full-blown tree, all the details. So there's a stage in the cognitive process called Binah that develops that schalkus. On the other hand, however, he says, Makol Mokim, and nevertheless, Yesh Gamkin Iskalus Hamidus. So this is going to go back to the other side of the coin. Though the midas branch off, Chesed and Gvura, but they don't become completely independent entities. They're interactive and they're interconnected. So keep in mind the concept of Ischalkus and Iskalulus is a theme in Chassidus. Ischalkus refers to distinction and breakdown and a structural the difference between things. Iskalus is their symbiotic connection, and they're complementing each other and interacting with each other. So, for example, if you said the human body, is it Ischalkus or Iskalus? The answer is both. On one hand, the body is made up of parts. There's a head, there's a torso, there's a body, there's a regel, a leg, there's a brain, there's a heart, a liver, lungs. I mean, you go on and on, you break it down further, you go down to 35 to 75 trillion cells. But at the same time, in a healthy human being, all these parts are working together like one symmetry, where it's one entity. It's like one machine with many parts. So the Hischalkus focuses on the distinctions, the differences between them, and their different needs and their different definitions. And the Iskalus focuses on their interconnectivity. She says, Makol Mokim, though we just focused on their distinction that Binah creates, because Binah is a divider, in a sense, Binah breaks things down into details. That's so good. The Seichel also has another thing that it influences the Midas. It makes them work together in a coordinated way. And what does that define? What does that mean? Not sure why it says vigam. I would think that's what he wanted to say. Let me read it again. Okay. No, it's correct. I think I read it a bit differently, but it means both things. He's saying that the seichel itself doesn't just compel there should be chesed. It also calls there should also be gvura. Is bechesed, that the seichel has to go into an inclination of chesed and what we called before the approach of merit, finding finding the leniency, but also in gvura. So seichel never comes and just says chesed alone. It also teaches us and compels us to understand that you also need gvura. So he's not just talking about that in the chesed you need gvura, but that as far as the midas go, there's also just like there's chesed, there's also gvura. U'kamoshin is bar le'il dibra masku boker v'yedei Hashem in the Maimer boker v'yedei Hashem, a Maimer of Korach, back in, where does he say, in volume 1, page 527. He discusses this is Chassidus. However, qualifying this is Chassidus is after there's ischalkus. In other words, after you have, let's talk about Shammai and Hillel. After the seichel is mechayev, a certain approach which is more chesed, another approach gvura, and the seichel also tells you that you can't just have chesed, you also have to have gvura. So there's no such thing as just one without the other. That second point I just made comes after you distinguish. There's the two, comes the scholars that they all need each other and they all complement each other. I want to just see that mimer for a second, since he's referring to it, to make sure I understand right how he's defining the scholars. There's a lot of ways to define the scholars. So let me just look it up a second. 527, Tov Kuf Chav Zayin, page 527. Yeah, that was the big theme, right? There he was talking the difference between Toyu and Tikkun, where Toyu, what dominates is Ischalkus, each midah on its own. And there is no real interconnectivity, which is why Toyu is not a functional world. And ultimately it shatters. There's no cooperation. He compared midas doim, shali, shali, shalach, shalach. What's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. Chesed says, I don't want to have anything to do with you, Gvura. I'll be fine, you be fine. We don't need to interact. That's the key thing there. And there he explains how Chochma and Binah too, but how Seichel weakens that intensity of each midah just being on its own. It teaches, it sublimates the midas to understand you need each other. And you complement each other. That was the theme there. But I want to see specifically yeah. He actually distinguishes also there between Chochma and Binah. That Chochma's way of affecting the midas is b'derech memela, the bitl of Chochma. And Binah does it through involving itself and actually training and educating the midas to work with each other. Yeah, now I remember. Now, it's like in mediation, when you have a proper mediation between two people who have a disagreement. So the first step is to weaken and tame each one's intensity. When one person says, I'm 100% right, and is completely adamant, and the other person says, I'm 100% right, you want to just both give them the opportunity to realize that maybe you're not 100% right, maybe 90. In other words, to weaken their intensity. And that Chochma does that. It's a type of bittul. It's like two people standing in front of someone they both respect. So they'll be a little more humble. Binah gets involved in the actual mediation of how they work together. Like, okay, what's your position? What's your position? How do we mediate? How do we find a compromise? How do we negotiate? So that's not relevant so much to our discussion, but he does distinguish between Chochma and Binah affecting the midas in their scholars. Like in the context of being a maturity and development. So obviously the midas, a child's emotions, which really run wild and are not tamed, because you don't yet have the mature mind to so-called navigate and harness and direct the midas. But an adult, there's also levels of what you're doing exactly to make sure that the midas are not just on their own, but they're being sublimated and directed properly. So that's what he discusses there. Okay.
Can you please explain how Chochma does that? Because I can't quite grasp that. I can understand how Binah does it.
I would suggest you go back to what we learned there on page 527, where he discusses it. As far as what we learned here, he spoke about Chochma creates bittul in the midas, because Chochma is not about you. It's about you standing in the presence and being absorbed in something greater than you are. So that automatically weakens your subjective emotions and their hold on you and their pull on you. That's what we learned here, that Chochma creates the bittul of midas. But there he goes into break down more. Binah, as we said, is more commensurate with the midas because its structure, it's yesh. So Binah, as I just explained, the respect for the mediator will cause a certain humility, and Binah will be the part where the mediator uses his intelligence to find common denominators between the two parties and find ways of compromise or even more complementation and so on, where they come to learn to work with each other. So that requires a real process of discussion and thinking it through well. Chochma, automatically, as soon as you're in the presence of someone like, let's say, the Rebbe, or in presence of a Rav or of a mentor, someone you respect, there's just an element of being receptive to cooperation or receptive to not being so convinced that your midah is the only one that is correct. Okay. But more details, I would suggest to go there.
Yeah, I still don't understand, but how Chochma, which is so bittul, I thought it's bittul for himself, it actually, just by his presence, I can understand, but as an active participant.
Every human being has Chochma within them. Every human being has Chochma. So when Chochma is active, it affects a human being. I've talked about it for hours, of how when you're absorbed in a higher reality, your midas also become elevated to that place where there's no distinction between object and subject. You become completely absorbed in something greater than you are. The emotions on their own are subjective realities. You have Chochma within you. It's not someone else's Chochma. I just gave an example with the mediator. But when your Chochma within you, when you allow yourself to experience what he called before the bittul of Chochma, the hanocha sichlis, the resonance of Chochma, the visualization and clarity of Chochma, that has a direct impact on a person's being. So when a person is experiencing the divine on a Chochma level, it absorbs you, it becomes something completely beyond your emotions. And he said that's b'derech memela. If you recall, on the pages where he spoke about the bittul of Chochma on the midas is b'derech memela, and by Binah he said it's not b'derech memela. Where was that?
Yeah, I think I understand. Thank you.
Since you paused, can you take a question about what we just learned this past pasuk?
Sure.
So the idea of sechel, mochin, basically the brain, controlling, guiding the emotions, and this idea of hiskalos is it the idea that that because the brain or mochin cognition drives the emotions, or chachma, the hiskalos is the notion that the different emotions, the midos, are essentially yielding to mochin and sechel and saying, I got a situation here, and I'm not quite sure what to feel. Should I feel gvura, or should I feel chesed, whatever? And because the sechel is driving it, so the hiskalolus is a kind of like the limbs of the body. So the
what's
brain.
The question? So what's the question?
I'm trying to understand this concept of hiskalolus. Is what he's saying
then I was 1 second. I didn't finish. We didn't finish the hiskalolus, so I was going to continue. We're in the middle. Lang just brought up a question. He wanted to understand chachma, but the hiskalolus, we haven't finised the discussion here. So why don't we finish?
I'm just trying to understand I'm trying to understand what he just said. He's Geshgampani Skalos. I mean, we're
in the middle of a paragraph. He didn't finish saying it. So let's finish, and then we'll discuss it.
Okay. But is that what the last sentence says? Sechel has to determine which midah is going to be. Yeah.
He didn't say that, no.
Oh.
He didn't say that, at least not in my reading. Just 1 minute. I'm just looking. I want to look something up that just came. Oh. Yeah, the B'derech Mamela that I just was referring to is top of page 1230. Yeah. Whereas in Binah, it's Levushe Hasaga. Okay, that's connected to our discussion here. Okay. Well, this is exactly the reason I don't like to take the question when I'm talking now Tzvi. I mean, I responded, but because now the whole flow, everybody that was learning, we have to go back over it now. We went on a distraction here. So let me go back to what he said here. Okay, so after explaining that there's a distinction between emotions, chesed, gvura, and that distinction is derived from the distinction in different ways of contemplating, he says, mokim, they're not just separate midas, chesed and gvura. There's also a scholars that the seichel creates. So besides the seichel giving birth to the emotions, in addition to that, the seichel creating the distinction to the emotions. Seichel here meaning Binah, the hasaga of Binah. There's yet another thing, which is the scholars, that the midas interact and are interconnected with each other, which is the scholars. Like you just said, the seichel itself is mechayiv, shetzorach is bechesed, v'gam begvura. There's no such thing as just one emotion. There has to be another. And explaining back in the Maimah that he refers to Beker v'yedei Hashem, that they interact, one is encompassed in the other. Just to give an example, even when you have chesed, you always have to have a gvura sheba chesed. Because if a person is just giving love, and the flow is going, and there's no discipline and no regulation, you could also flood the fields. Or emotionally speaking, you could end up overwhelming somebody and drowning them in your love. Love needs discipline, and discipline needs love. That's why you have chesed sheba gvura, gvura sheba chesed, and you have teferah sheba chesed, and netzach sheba chesed. Like we say in Sfiras HaEmer, 7 times 7, 49, interconnected emotions. That's when they are in their healthiest way. That's one element of Hiskalus. Another Hiskalus is that the mere fact that a human being cannot just live on chesed. We also have to have gvura in our lives, not just the gvura within chesed. So Shammai and Hillel both are necessary because each one teaches us another dimension. And we need, in life, we need both of them. Another example of chesed sheba gvura is when it says, V'shavto ha'eda v'hitzilu ha'eda, that you shall judge the nation, but you shall also preserve them, save them. Because the din, even when sitting in judgment, the goal is to bring salvation, not just judgment as an end in itself. Or like Rashi says in the beginning of Chumash, that at the beginning God wanted to create the world with midas hadin, tzimtzum, and he saw the world wouldn't survive. So shittif imay midas harachme. He also brought in shittif, meaning like he partnered with it, also compassion. So all this is the seichel directing midas. When you talk about, let's say, a child's emotions, like we see, a child can suddenly be laughing, a second later they're crying. Besides the fact that their emotions are not tamed and everything is so intense, and it needs seichel as we grow to so-called sublimate, harness, direct, and guide the emotions. We're talking about even the natural emotions. There's another thing. By a child, the emotions are not biskalus always. When something is good, it's all the way good. They don't realize, a child, because the discernment of cognizance and mind is not there yet to decide, this is also, it may not look so good, but it really is good for you. or the other way around. It may look good, but it's really not good for you. Just as a simple example, the idea of the nuances that are part of any life experience, that things are not just black and white. So all this, the seichel, in other words, in addition, what we said, ischalkus creates iskalus. It's mechayev iskalus. However, this iskalus comes after the ischalkus. In other words, we're not talking about how it's all encompassed in the source, where chesed and gvura and everything is one, like in Chochma or even higher than that. We're talking about, yes, there's a structure. Like I said, a structure of the human body, a structure of emotions. And then the seichel, then comes the second message, is that work together, cooperate with each other, coordinate, complement each other. Okay. V'gam, and additionally, she'iskalus hi ayidei she'es seichel miyuchad l'chol davar befrat. He's going to explain now how the ischalkus and the iskalus are not two separate things. They themselves complement each other. That the iskalus is ayidei she'es seichel miyuchad l'chol davar befrat, like we learned before. There's a particular seichel that elicits the midah of ava. What is that seichel we learned? When you think about the benefits and the love and the kindness and the closeness that God, or it could be a person, has to you, it evokes and stimulates a love, an ava. So it's a particular seichel. So the seichel comes in many different details. And it creates a distinction of every separate midah, as explained there. He's referring to that Maimer Boker Yudea that I just looked at in volume 1. So on one hand, you have a seichel. Every seichel is leading to a particular emotion. So when you're learning something, the breakdown, like we learned before, each part directs you to a particular inclination. So not only does the scholars come after this, the schalkus, it's actually an outgrowth of the distinctions. Because as you learn it, you learn how each part of the seichel leads you to one particular. Like you learn something, or you contemplate it, and it leads you to chesed. Then you learn another piece of it, and it leads you to gevura. So that alone tells you the seichel is leading you to different midas. So the seichel, like he says here, the schalkus itself, his gufa idei schalkus. So Binah, this is all the process of Binah. In other words, to put it in simple English, when a person is a mature mind and you contemplate on something, even if one part of your contemplation leads you to one nuance or to one inclination, because you're a mature mind, you realize it's more complex than that. And you continue reading, you say, oh, 1 second, there's a qualification. That leads me to a different aspect. So there's never a black and white, sharp chesed or gvura. The mind and its maturity understands and appreciates the different gray areas and the nuances that are part of the whole process. So indeed, on one hand, yes, chesed is chesed and gvura is gvura. That's the ischalkus. But the ischalkus itself is not meant to be exclusive. Part of the mind's function is also to understand how you connect them all. So like any good mind, when you learn something well, you come to a certain conclusion. But you then continue learning it more and you realize it's a bigger picture. So the mind is also telling you not only the specific details, it's also telling you how they all come together and tell a larger story. It's like when you read Lahavdil, a book, and one chapter is a very dramatic chapter that's very frightening. But then there's a certain tension. But then you continue reading the next chapter and there's a resolution. And you realize, don't just come to a conclusion after one chapter. You have to understand the whole picture. So when Binah does both things, it breaks down the specifics so you understand it in a specific way. It leads you to a certain midah. First a seichel dika midah, then an emotional one. And then it also continues and appreciating how they all complement each other and all work together. That's what Binah accomplishes. So both ischalkus and iskalus. Now he's going to go in the parentheses and refer to what I mentioned before back in that mimer in volume 1, what Chochma accomplishes in this. Okay. I'm going to pause before I go to the parentheses. Now, I think let me see. Okay, he's going to talk more about his chalkas, his kalas from the level of Chochma. But I think from the Binah level, I think he's concluded the point. There's probably going to be more on it. But now, if anybody has any questions on what we just learned. All clear? Yitzchak, it's all clear to you?
Clear enough. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So now, in the parentheses, he says like this. So this was all part of a contemplative process. The contemplation of Binah and how it comes to different so-called emotional inclinations, and then how both the distinction between them and how they work together. I'll just give an example, even though it's not an example he gives here, but I'll give an example. Let us say, we'll use an example from a court of law. Somebody is found guilty of whatever crime or whatever that we were accused of. And then the judge qualifies the guilt and says that though guilty, however, I'm going to give a lenient punishment. Why? Because I found some merit in the arguments and the intentions and so on. So though, yes, you're guilty of the actual crime, but there's different levels. Now, a child, a person with lesser developed mind would not necessarily appreciate that or understand what that means. You're guilty, and that's it. Gvura. It's gvura and gvura alone. But a more mature mind would understand, 1 second, gvura is correct. That's the prominent or the dominant midah, but there's also rachmanis. There's compassion. And there's also taking into consideration different details. Not every crime is done the same way with the same intentions and so on. So though, yes, gvura, but the gvura is somewhat cushioned by other midas. This is how a mature mind works. And frankly, if we use this formula, we'd have far less machlekes and far less disagreements. I mean, unhealthy disagreements. There's nothing wrong with having two opinions. But things get so personalized and sometimes so extreme that you're totally wrong and I'm totally right. When in truth, if you step back and you think about it more objectively, with a mind, with Binah, you take it apart and say, 1 second, let me hear your argument, and let me hear your argument. And when you can come away that each one actually has some merit, each argument. And then you know what? You can come away with the conclusion that both sides, as extreme as they were, helped you create a new conclusion that has the best of both worlds. This is called mature, intelligent thinking. Many of us, and I'm not going to say us, maybe present company excluded, but many people on earth don't have the patience or the bittul, the humility, or the other requirements to come to that. So there becomes a very polarized situation. And even if you have merit to your argument, you just don't leave room and understand that things can complement each other. So a healthy mind is going to do both things. It's going to listen to every argument fully. It's going to listen to every piece of the puzzle, the logic, to see what case you're making. You're making a very powerful case for chesed, great. Then the other party makes a very great, powerful case for gvura, but it will continue and say, 1 second, you both have a good points, but there's something that can be learned from both of you, and maybe it comes together. Or maybe we need both midas, different circumstances, different situations. This is where the mature mind really takes and controls the situation and doesn't let the emotions just, whatever I feel, that's what it is. It's just one example of how this is applied in the context of what we're discussing here, how Binah is elevating the emotions. So it's true, it gives birth to the emotions. The emotions are mitzias davar. We're not talking about chochma now. We're talking that they exist. They have an identity, chesed, gvura, like we discussed at length last few pages. And each one has their position. It's solidified. And yet, there's also a scholus that comes after the schalkus. And indeed, the schalkus itself, like he says, the scholus itself, zegufai de schalkus. That itself comes from distinction, which most people would say, 1 second, they're separate. How could they lead to complementation? That's why I wanted to give this example. Because the more you understand this separation, actually, the more you can come to even a better picture and a greater picture of the scholus, that how they all work together. There's only one example. I'm sure there are many others of how to apply that, but that's one. This is the Binah process. Va'bitl va'achlishus, in the parentheses he says, and the bitl, the sublimation, or you can also say it's another word I want to use, not that the midas are both understanding how you interact with each other, but they're both humbled, so to speak. Habitl va'achlishus, and the weakening of the midah. In the midah be'etzem, lias nesen mokem l'midah acheres. That the midah itself has to be weak in some way, not in a bad way, weakened, that shouldn't be so self-consumed, so it should leave room for the other. Hu mebchinas ha-chochma dafke. That's what chochma achieves. U'kamoshon is barliel dibra mastel v'yas kolov. That's the mimer before the mimer that he just referred to. The V'yas kolov also in volume 1, page 522, he says. And this was where the example I gave before. In mediation, which I do, unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever you want to call it, often, you have two people have different opinions, spouses, business partners, or in general, two people in an organization, a meshechist and a non-meshechist, and they have different positions on something. What's the first step that's necessary? I just had more than once, unfortunately, where sometimes a couple, they don't even want to come sit together at the same table. Literally. Can't stand sitting in his presence. I can't stand being in her presence. It's right away going to become a war. We can't even agree to disagree. We can't even agree to sit together. So what's the first step? I mean, obviously I can't be a babysitter and I can't force them, but the first step is just to get them a little, to lower the volume and lower the heat, the temperature, that you can just be able to just sit, forget about anything else. Now that does not come with logic per se. Yes, it can come with logic, trying to explain to them, listen, you have a marriage or you have a partnership. It would be good for both of you to work together, right? You both want that. Yeah, but I can't deal with it. So the first step is to try to humble. And sometimes being the person, if they respect you, like when someone calls me, not that I need the covet, I say, and they tell me afterwards, I can't sit with other, but I said, so why'd you call me? Why are you calling me exactly? That I should agree with you? You want me to help out? You need to, I don't say shut your mouth, but you need to show up. And I tell that to both people. If people are not willing to, now, why am I so-called pulling rank? Because you need to be mevatel a little. Not because it's trying to do anything. I'm not trying to manipulate, but if you don't have an initial even opening and you're just so enraged, for example, there's not even opening. So Chochma's role is softening everything up. Since Chochma is higher than Binah, and Chochma has a fundamental bittul, so Chochma has the power from the outside, not engaging. It's like two people who go in front of the Rebbe. The mere fact they're standing there, they're going to be hopefully a little humbled. And that humility opens room that now there's at least room for one. There's room. That means they agree yet. There's no mediation yet, but the first step has been achieved. So let's say you get these two people now sitting at the table and they're both silent. They're both furious at each other. So the first step is to say, look, can we just quiet down? Let's get the emotions out of the way as much as we can. And just let's everyone listen to the other. So like he says here, just give nation mokum l'midah acheres. That in other words, don't completely dominate the scene and it's only you that matters. Leave room that there's another person. We're not talking about agreeing with them. We're not talking about cooperating. So Chochma has that power of bittul to affect the midas in that way that they should just be open to listening to each other. Now, of course, I use a very human example. When it comes to Chesed and Gvura and Atzilus, You don't have a conflict on that level like I just described. But still, chesed is chesed, gvura is gvura. And they need to figure out how to so-called lower their volume so chesed can at least leave room for gvura. Like we learned back then in Vayas Kolov, he spoke about Zdoim, I said, there's no room for b'shali, shali, shalach, shalach, that's it. I don't have any relationship with you. I'm not going to fight with you, but I have no relationship with you. So the first step is leaving space for the other. Once you leave space for the other, then comes Binah that can now say, now that that's there, let's figure out, can we actually hear each other? Can we learn from each other? Can we grow? Can you complement? And the goal, of course, would be that chesed and gvura, like we said, that the ischalkus would lead to iskalulus. Whereas Chochma's main role, like he said, is just the what he calls the bittul and the habittul v'achlishes ba'amida. Okay. And then Binah is more engaging in that sense. But I'm trying to find an example with Moshe and Aaron. Because in a way, Moshe was like Chochma, he was the Rebbe. But Aaron engaged with the people, he made peace between the disagreeing parties. He would go to them and talk to them and tell them the other person who you think is your enemy says something good about you. Moshe was more on a higher level. He was not engaged on that level of, so in a way it was like a Chochma and Binah relation. But Moshe's power was his authority, his Ishalikim, divine. The people, the respect for him created a certain so-called softening of people's intense emotions. But Aaron came in and did the actually nitty-gritty work of creating true reconciliation and so on. So it's a little example to that. I'm just trying to find if there's an actual example. I don't recall something right now. Okay. So now, any questions on this, what we just discussed? Okay. So now that we've established what Binah, how the iskalus of midas is inside of Binah,
I want to say it's like the godliness of Chochma. It's amazing.
Yeah. That's exactly the point. The question on an operative level, or operational level, how do you get to this point internally? So Chochma is almost like a flash, an epiphany. Let's say Yom Kippur, just as using an example, maybe even higher than Chochma. But in context, I'm just using it as an example. Let's say you have a moment, a day, a holy day, and you just feel that awe. So many people, even if they have disagreements with someone else, or even if their emotions are very strong, they will, on a day like that, say, today is a day Yom Kippur, it's a holy day. Everything's going to be much quieter. I'm not going to argue with anyone. I'll even forgive or ask for forgiveness. And in general, your own taivas even, your emotions are not going to be wild. I mean, I'm not saying everybody's that way Yom Kippur, but you could see how Yom Kippur could affect even people like us. You don't have to be on the highest level. That would be somewhat of a taste of Chochma, like a higher force coming in, and just a sense that today is a day where, it's not a day for the Yetzer Hara, it's not a day for my midas to do whatever they like. It's a day of God, a godly day, a divine day, a holy day. Rosh Hashanah as well. I'm not saying just Yom Kippur. That would be somewhat like Chochma's presence, just causing a certain, what's the word? Taming, humble, humility, etc. Bittul. Binah would be much more when you're dealing with a regular day in the week, and your emotions are active. How to figure out how to explain it to them. So you could see them working together. For Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur work well. Then hopefully that so-called Chochma energy can inform Binah, which in turn, and of course it's affected the midas to now listen and maybe learn something and be educated and trained, not just on a holy day, but throughout the year to be more refined. I mean, just using a very practical application. I'm not saying that's what the Rebbe Rashab is actually saying here, but it's definitely an application that we can derive from this. He may actually, as we go along, may actually explain this more, but we'll see. But just to make it a little more palpable. The rest of the paragraph, he goes now to Binah, to Chochma, sorry. After explaining how Binah works, what?
Question for you. In your example of Moshe and Aaron, that Aaron would be able to do the mediation, so to speak, bring peace. He didn't. Moshe was the one that inspired Bittul from Chochma, whereas he was. What I'm saying is that it seems like, how was Aaron able to accomplish that if he's just really Binah, if he doesn't have that Chochma of authority that Moshe Rabbeinu had?
Well, it could be Moshe's presence allowed for people to be a little less arrogant or locked in. And once you have that presence, which was there, they all knew Moshe was there, then Aaron comes in, it's easy. It's like you soften up the resistance, Moshe does, and then Aaron does his thing. So it wasn't that Moshe was involved in every sichsoch or disagreement, but his presence. I mean, just an example I was trying to just find. I don't know if it's a complete example. It's just, I wish there was a scenario like that where you actually have Moshe saying something and then Aaron coming in. Sometimes you have, let's say, a disagreement among employees. So the big honcho, the head of the company, comes in and makes an opening statement. And then he says, okay, now my assistant's going to deal with the details, that type of thing. Something like that, where the top person just gets everybody's attention,
Like the Rebbe saying, listen to the Rabbanim, and then it carries us all, and that's it.
Did it work?
I think so.
So most of the time.
Okay, I hope so. Good. Yeah, something like that. That's correct. It's almost like by Matan Torah, Nasav and Nishma, that first there's a general bittul that you have to have. You have to be receptive. If you're not receptive, how can I talk to you? Hashem is saying, and I'm going to give you the details. Kablu malchusei v'achar kablu gzeresei. It's a fascinating formula. There's no question about it. It also
amazing.
Yeah,
amazing. And Rosh Hashanah is accepting the authority. It's Chochma, so to speak, authority, the bittul to Melech, and then Yom Kippur is you're getting to the details about what do I have to change my meters, which is Binah. So if you could look at that way, maybe Rosh Hashanah is Chochma and
I would probably say Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Chochma, maybe Sukkot is more like that. Ema banim smecha. Remember, Chochma is Eira, Binah Simcha.
Yes. Wow.
And then, of course, the days afterwards. It's for sure the case. Like when you daven in the morning, you say Moida Ani, Hoidu, Moidim. And in general, davening is more of a bittul. And then after davening, or even during davening, later you get more of a cheshbon hanefesh. You start dealing with the nitty-gritty, the details. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, so now, I'll try to finish the paragraph. Remember, all this is Binah. This was all talking about midas that are apparent, that are sensed, that are experienced. Yes, they're sublimated. They're on a seichel level in Binah, Chesed, Gvura, and they're separate, distinct from one another, and also scholars. They work together. But in Chochma, they never became ischalkus. There's no ischalkus because there's no mitzias. And that's why Kumoy Kain, because they're not a mitzias, who be izgalus, when you're talking about the midas as they originate from Chochma, ein zebov b'chinas ischalkus. They don't manifest in a distinct way because they don't have any substance. There, the main force is the power of the bitl of Chochma, like he spoke about, that the person is completely absorbed with godliness. Like we find sheyachaliyas beis amidas the chesed v'gvura metam usfarecha. Remember we said before with Shammai and Hillel, they learned from one teacher, or actually Shmaya and Naftalion, but it was one source, and they learned from one source, and this one took chesed, this one took gvura, the same svara that Shmaya or Naftalion said. Shammai heard gvura, Hillel heard chesed. So you see that you can have both midas, mitam v'svarachas. Not like with Binah, we said each svara, each contemplation leads to a particular emotion. That's different than a different emotion. But then Binah also the mind also tells you they work together. They need each other. Here, initially, they never had the distinction. The same svara is on such a subtle level, like the seed, that you don't see the difference between a branch or a fruit. Or in this case, both midas, you could have one reason, one theory, and that should lead to both. It's so abstract that it could lead to both. I remember even by the Farbrengens of the Rebbe, there were times where it was very clear. The Rebbe said something, clear idea. Okay. Sometimes the Rebbe said something, we literally disagreed whether what the Rebbe said meant this, and some people said it meant the exact opposite. How's that possible? Because the idea, and I'm not talking about one is right or wrong, because sometimes the idea still remains abstract enough to not be able to define, is it this or this? It's a theory. Like we see by the Mabul, by the flood. What does the pasuk say? The ksiv, ki yetze machshavas libay, rak ra. So the end of Parsha Bereshis, it says, when it says v'yisatzev al libay, God created the world. Of course, He created for a purpose, la'avda l'shamra, to serve and protect, to serve God. And what happened? The world got corrupt, and it got worse and worse. So right before the Mabul, the end of Bereshis, Hashem says, I look at the world that I created. People are just driven by their evil inclination. God gave the reason, l'chayv, which means that they deserve to be destroyed. L'chayv means that they're guilty. And then you see the pasuk continues and says the same Eibishter says, gufa tam l'schus. God says, so this the same thing, because they're so evil, that's what we need to have, compassion for them. Kinachem Hashem, compassion to give them a chance to correct their ways. So the same idea, whether their corruption can lead to two different conclusions. One is they deserve to be punished. The other, they deserve compassion to correct their ways because they are in a very weakened state. Because that inclination of the heart of a person is evil from childhood. You know, the evil inclination. And because of that, the pasuk says, I no longer will curse them. I will no longer destroy them. In other words, it's almost evoking compassion. What should the people I created are flawed. So how could I continue to punish them? And the same reason you could say that's why they deserve punishment. So he says, how is it possible that the same argument, which means that we're not talking about that God said He found the merit in them. That comes afterwards. Noach was ish tzaddik. We're talking about the same reason, that because they're corrupt, you can argue corruption deserves some consequences or serious consequences, or corruption says, one second, I created them. That's how they're created that way. So how could I hurt them? So he says, this dafka, this comes dafka from primis ha-chochma, like it says in Teres Chaim from the Mittler Rebbe, Dibra Maslo Bereshis Drusha Beis. The second mimer of Bereshis in Teres Chaim discusses this at length. So I know this needs to be unpacked. This itself is a pretty a heavy statement we just read. But he wants to show that mitzad Binah, you would have two arguments, and you either have to choose, or you'd find some way to find some compromise. In Chochma, the same argument, the same theory can lead to very different conclusions. Chesed and Gvura. Do you have compassion for someone who's done something wrong, or do you say no, they deserve to be punished? The same theory can go both directions. So I'm going to look up the Teres Chaim over Shabbos, hopefully, and maybe get a little more information before analyzing this last piece. But what he wants to express through this is to show that Chochma is in a place where the same idea can lead to Chesed or Gvura. Not two different ideas, the same. But it's an interesting example. It also, as I said, it opens up a whole Pandora's box of questions. which I'm sure you're all realizing as well. So, but I'll stop here. And this we'll talk about more on Sunday. I'm going to look it up. I want to see inside the Teres Chaim, see how he explains it. But if any questions, if you have questions on this last piece, let's wait till Sunday because I want to see inside more to be able to really understand it better.
Yeah, man, I can't wait till Sunday. Unbelievable stuff.
I have a question just to contrast it with Binah, not to delve into this. I hear what you're saying. Let's wait before you to unpack it more. But is the flip side of this last statement that the point that Binah has the capacity to draw things out, to mechalek them, and to actually to have sechel come to some determination about how to come down ultimately, and in that regard, referring to what's above that, to have a considered assessment, meaning not all gvura or all chesed, but okay, maybe gvura with some chesed or chesed with some gvura, but the point, the function of Binah. No,
yeah, it's possible. That's why I want to look in Teres Chaim. It's possible because I have a bigger question before I answer your question. If Hashem at the end of the day did bring the Mabul and destroyed the whole world, and he saved Noach and his family, so why do we need to know his thought process? That first he thought this and then he thought that. So I'm thinking, and I want to look in Teres Chaim to make sure that I'm right, that maybe the end of Bereshis is more Pnimis Chochma, which is God is thinking and revealing to us that on one stage, that same thought about the negativity, the corruption of the world would lead either to Chesed, to Gvura or Chesed. Once you come in Parsha Noach, maybe Binah resolved the issue by saying, destroy the whole world, but save Noach. So there's Gvura, a lot of Gvura, but God didn't destroy the whole universe. He did leave Noach and he did leave the species of all the animals, so you can rebuild a new world. So it could be that those two steps are both there. The Chochma really is more, the same idea can lead to both, but it's not conclusive. And the conclusion is what actually happened. There was a Mabul, and at the same time there was a salvation and a rebuilding. Maybe.
It's very hard to understand a mashal like this because it's God all-knowing, and it's almost like he thought in stages, which he thinks different than us. That's maybe the way we did.
No, because God
I got to understand why he gave this mashal.
No, because I'll tell you why. God, this is part of the process of our partnership and the interface. Hashem wants to manifest in a way that we could understand some of the processing. Obviously,
that makes it easy. That makes it easy because he's playing the human being card at that point. I got you.
Yeah, so
really resolves.
Obviously, he could do whatever he wants. He created the world. He could destroy the world. He didn't have to create the world in the first place either. He created. Of course, he knew when he created the world that he created who created the serpent? Who created the Eitz Hadas? Okay. We'll talk about this more. So Yitzchak, you see what I said? How I responded?
Yeah,
okay.
I think we're saying the same thing. I was trying to expand
I don't know,
it more
however,
generally.
if I'm correct at all. It may not say anything like this in Teres Chaim. I'm just thinking the process, the next step would be, look, God did make a decision. He did make a decision at the end. And the decision did include both Chesed and Gvura. That's very clear. He destroyed it also.
I guess the broader question is that it's almost like there's a partnership between Chochma and Binah. So Chochma has a havraka, a flash of possibilities of how something can be interpreted. Inside the tipa is a variety of possibilities of how one might understand something, how one might come out, how one might what might actually develop in reality, because you have to make a decision how you're going to behave or how you're going to see something, and that may drive action. So, but Binah then has to go from there, take those possibilities, and kind of, like I said, Mechalek has to differentiate things.
Well, like you said in the mimer here, yeah. The thing is also the main focus, I think, here is the bittul of the midas. That in Binah, it's not total bittul, and Chochma is going to be total bittul. That's where he's leading up to, because that's the real focus here, how the midas get elevated. So it's correct in the process of the cognitive process. In Chochma, it's like a seed, and Binah develops it. That's clear, like a mother, father and mother, the child, the fetus in the mother's womb. But then there's also the element of bittul that's going to ultimately lead to it. But okay, so good. We're
on the right track. Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Okay. So we're
Everyone have
stopping
a
here.
good Shabbos.
We're stopping here. The end of the end of